So if you were to work with icons, graphics, do you usually go for bitmap or vectors like SVGs, yeah? So show of hands for bitmaps. Okay. Vectors? That's right. So most of you selected vectors. And if you did that, there's only one guy to be thankful for, the father of the SVG itself. He's called SVJesus on Twitter. And he's here to talk all about CSS fonts for today. Let me welcome to the stage, Chris Lilley.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Excellent. So, you don't need this slide, we already know who I am. I just wanted to mention briefly what I do. I work at W3C. I'm the technical director there. I started SVG. I didn't do it myself, obviously. I just got the people in the room and pushed them until they all agreed and we were going to make a new standard. I also was one of the co-authors of PNG. More relevant for this talk, I'm co-editor of CSS Fonts 3 and Fonts 4. Show of hands time again. How many people here use web fonts on their websites? Yeah, easier question. How many people don't? Yeah, right. Actually, something like 70–75% of all websites now use web fonts. 8 years ago, that answer was like 2%. So things have changed quite a bit. So everyone uses them, but not everyone uses them fully, to their fullest extent. Yeah, so I was involved in web fonts as well, particularly chromatic fonts, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. So what are we going to talk about today? The first thing I'm going to do is go through some basics to make sure that everyone's using the same terminology, that we all know what we're talking about. Then I'm going to talk about variable fonts. You already saw variable fonts today, at least once. It was in Leah's talk, and I believe there's more uses of variable fonts. We're going to talk about color fonts. And lastly, I'm going to do the open type features. Now, this is actually mostly in Fonts 3, so it's already implemented, it's already used there, but not everyone knows about it, so I wanted to make sure you did. So, first thing, actually, first question. What is that? What is that picture of? Do you know? Yes, stamps, metal stamps. It says Helvetica, and it says it backwards, because this is actually what you would put the ink on to print on paper. But we've come on a bit since we had to cast metal. Okay, so a character, that's the first, most basic thing. What is a character? A character is just a number, like A is 65. And it also has properties, things that say A is a letter. It is not a number. It is not punctuation, this sort of thing. A glyph, on the other hand, is what you actually think of when you're looking at it, when you're reading it. It's the shape that you see on screen or on print. So you can't have glyphs without characters, but you can have characters without glyphs. For example, if you're listening to the text being read out, you don't have any glyphs, but you still have characters. So what are we looking at here? What's that? It's a glyph. Good. How many characters is it? 2, yes. Anyone that said 1 is partially correct, but also wrong, because you should never use the FI ligature, because otherwise your search won't work. And it is a single glyph. Another example. This is the E acute. How many characters? 1 or 2. You can actually do it as a single character or as 2 ones. You can have an E plus a combining accent. So, trick question there, slightly. I like trick questions, just as a warning. It's a single glyph either way. It'll be the same glyph. And if you're really unlucky, it'll actually come from 2 separate fonts, and then it'll look terrible. So don't ever do that. Okay, some more terminology. Here are some fonts. Now, Myriad Pro, for example, that's an example of a font family. There are more than one font in that. There's some light ones, some bold ones, some condensed ones, expanded, etc. So those are the individual faces within that family. That's why it's called apt font face, because you're defining a single face within a single family. Okay, so I guess if I asked you what's a CSS property, everyone will go, yeah, that's basic, we know that. But could you explain the difference between a descriptor and a property? A descriptor says what the font can do. For example, this font can do bold. A property is a request. It says, I want this text here, whatever the selector matches on, to be in bold, and then it will see, well, I have a bold font over here, I'll use that. So here's an example. If we look at this at font face there, it has a font weight of bold, which means this font can do bold. And then for the H1, we say we want that particular font family, and we want it in bold, and so they match. Now, you don't typically use just a single font. Normally, you'll actually use more than one. You have a list, what's called a font stack. Let's actually see you, that's better. And the first one with a particular glyph is used. So, have you ever had an email in English, but from like Japanese or Chinese developer, and it looks terrible, right? It doesn't look like the same as all the other emails you get. And the reason for that is because most Japanese fonts have really bad Latin glyphs, the ones that you use for English. Now, that's fine. You can get around this by saying, here's my font stack. I'll put the Latin one first, Japanese one second. So great, we get the Latin glyphs that we want. But they can't both be first. What happens if we start getting some Japanese things in Latin.waf? Then they'll get used, and they're probably badly done. So how do you solve that? They can't both be first. You use a thing called Unicode range. Has anyone heard of this one? Excellent. Very good. So it's a descriptor. It's something you put on a font, and you say, what is the range of Unicode characters you can use? It does not guarantee that they're all available. What it's actually saying is, don't use anything I didn't list. So the initial value for that descriptor is all of them, but you can subset it down. So here's an example. We have a Japanese font, and we have this Unicode range, which, as you can read, it's A5, 4E00 to 9FFF. Just looking at that, you can tell that this is the yen symbol, it's kanji, it's hiragana, and katakana. Just looking at the numbers, right? No, you can't. I can't either. That's why I have the comment in there so I can remember which order they are. I am really sorry about the syntax for this. It's my fault. I invented it. I put it up on the mailing list. Everyone, Unicode was new, and people were writing U+ at the time, so I said, let's do that, and let's have some hex stuff and wildcards and whatever. And I said, I don't really like this, but I can't think of a better one. Silence on the mailing list. 3 weeks later, okay, fine, I'm putting this in the spec. It'll do for now. That was 20 years ago. It's still there for now. So I'm sorry. My apologies. Here's an example. So we want to have a fancy swash ligature there of the ampersand, but we don't want to have a span around the ampersand or anything nasty like that. So what we'll do is we'll use Unicode range. So there's the CSS. And as you see, once I put it in, then it becomes that. But if I delete off the Unicode range, then it gets used for everything. Okay, enough of that. That's the basics. Now let's go on to variable fonts. So this is an example of a typical font family, fairly recent one. This is a promotional image for it. And as you can see, there's a lot of different styles available in that one family. There's regular, there's wide, there's narrow, there's condensed, which is even more, a whole bunch of different weights. Great in print, but on the web, that's 37 different downloads. You don't really want to be doing that. So ordinary web fonts, the ones we use nowadays, you have to download all the separate files. New in CSS Fonts 4 is support for variable fonts. You download a single font, which has been designed to have a bunch of axes, ranges of variation, and you interpolate along those on the fly, and it basically spits out fonts without having to install them, whatever, it just generates them. So here's an example. Here's the letter Q, and here's the letter Q where the points have been moved over. In fact, that's actually how they're stored inside the font. It's a set of diffs. It's like move this point here, move this point here, and then you can obviously move it less or more, and that gives you, usually what you have is the middle one, and then a bold one, and then a light one, and you can produce anything else in between time. It's not quite as simple as that. The person who's designing the font has to make sure that all the points match up, have the same number of points, otherwise you'll get some horrible thing in between. But if it's done correctly, and in fact this is how fonts are really designed normally. It's just that previously the font designer then had to go through spitting out all the individual instances of that font. So there are 5 registered axes of variation. There's italics, which is basically on-off. It's like, is this italic or not? Optical size. If you have some text that's huge, it can be quite ornate and tricky and have a big range of thick and thin within the same glyph. But as that gets smaller and smaller and smaller, it tends to be simplified out. Now that's something that used to happen in metal type, for example. You would have different cases of type and they had simplified designs. Once we went to computer type setting, that kind of fell by the wayside, but now we can have it back again. The slant, if you have an oblique face, then it's sort of squished over, and you can say what the angle is. The width, which is how condensed or expanded we are. And the weight, how bold it is. So here's an example. We use a property called font variation settings. And then it has some horrible numbers that basically you have to look up and see what the particular font supports. So optical size is 32 point, the width is 0.7, and you'll have to look up in the font to see what 0.7 corresponds to. It's probably going to be on a range of like 0.5 to 1.5, but it varies. So really this is very low-level font specific. It works, but I wouldn't suggest that you do it that way. But before we go on, more audience participation, look at this. We've got font weight of 400, and then we set calc 9 times 100. What is the answer? Is it hands up for 400? Nobody fell for that. Okay. Hands up for 900. Hands up for Chris is asking another trick question. Okay. In CSS3, font weight was 100 or 200 or 300, etc. These were strings that looked like numbers. But if you use calc to get an actual integer, it won't work. So the answer previously was, yeah, you would get 400. But now, in CSS Fonts 4, we actually have a number from 1 to 999, as it makes sense. I mean, your old code will still work, right? It's just the way it's parsed is different. But that means you can use variable fonts. You can say, here is a font, and it does weights 300 to 700, say, and you can get anywhere on that axis. And that also means that what we've done is we've changed the good old properties like font weight, font stretch, etc., so that they take the same numbers you're used to using. So you can say font weight 362, that's going to be fairly light but not super light. Font stretch 70, where 100 is defined to be normal, smaller numbers are condensed. And font optical sizing, we just simplified this down to auto, which means you can either have auto or off, right? Because you shouldn't have to say, my font size is this and my optical size is the same as the font size, because it's pointless. You're putting the same number twice. So now we can use them like this. Both properties and descriptors with these common names, and apart from font optical sizing, you're used to these already. So here's an example. This is a font, an experimental variable font from Monotype called Kairos Sans, and that's 300, which is a lightweight, and that's 800, which is a bold weight. And then we can interpolate between to get all the different values. And there's only a single font being used there, just one download. Here's another example. Now here we're not only animating the weight, we're also animating the X height and the sort of curvature of the O and this sort of thing. So we have standard axes, we also have custom axes. Now, looking just at the standard axes for the moment, look at the descriptor now. Instead of having a single number for font weight, it has a range. It has two numbers. It can do anything between the first one and the second one. It can do font stretch between 50% and 200%. And the obliqueness, it can go between minus 10 degrees, in other words, tilting backwards, to 40 degrees forwards. And then, in the actual properties, we say what we want. We want oblique at 24 degrees. We want a font weight of 234. So this is using the old, the font variation settings. That's fine. But look, we've also got this radius property, which there isn't a standard CSS property corresponding to that. And we're animating the radius from 0.3 to 3.1 in this case. So that's changing the curviness of the font as it's being animated. Here's another example. So this font has 4 custom axes. It has a rounded slab axis, which I can change like this. See, it pokes out like that. And then it has a flare axis, so I can make it flared or not. And I can even skeletonize the font so that the middle of it hollows out or the terminals hollow out. And if I pick just the right values, it'll actually look not rubbish like that, but look quite nice. Okay. So this is an example. This is not my example. This is done by Mandy Kerr, who does a lot of these sorts of things on CodePen. So this font has a custom axis that says how many little twigs and branches of things are poking out of the font, and you can see that being animated there. And of course, this is still, it's text that you can just stick your cursor in and change. Here's another example. This font uses a single interpolating square to produce a sort of vectorized pixel font, which is a bizarre thing to want to do, but there we are. As soon as variable fonts came out, of course, people started doing the most stupid things with them just because they could, but people will settle down soon. It's the same as when desktop publishing came out. The first thing that happened was you got a newsletter that had 40 fonts on the one page, and it looked like a ransom note. But after a while, people realized how to use this new tool correctly. Here's a more reasonable example. Notice that as this gets bolder, at some point the designer's chosen that vertical stroke is kind of interfering, so let's just have it at the top and the bottom beyond a certain point. It's like a break point in the font. Okay, so this is kind of similar to what Leah was talking about earlier. We've got 2 axes here. We've got a width and we've got a weight. And you can see that as the weight goes up, because the glyphs are bigger, they're taking up more space, so the line length is changing. And when it's condensed, the line length gets shorter, but equally, as you put the weight up, it gets longer again. So there I've kept these as completely separate axes, but using something like CSS variables, for example, I could do something like that. I could find what specific weight corresponds to the width increase and then decrease it using the width parameter, so I have a constant width. Now you can see where I'm going here for this. Imagine this being used on a responsive design website. You've got a headline. You want the headline to be as bold as possible and take all the space it can. And when it's on a slightly different device with a slightly narrower thing, you also want it to be fractionally less bold, but still take up all the space. This sort of thing, that's how you can do that. Here's a final example. Eric van Blockland did this one. He's animating the width. He's animating the intercharacter spacing and all sorts of things so that this single word occupies the same space even though it's being animated. And it's this sort of aspect, once you get beyond animation, I mean, animation is used a lot to show you the range of things that can be doing. Mostly you won't be animating the font itself. You'll just be basically conjuring up custom things in your style sheet to use the range of variables that you have. But Jason Parmental gave a quote about this. He said, this is the most significant development for design since responsive design. It's like the next phase of responsive design is using variable fonts. I mean, it helps in other ways. It gives you a smaller download. If you have like more than 3 or so fonts from the same family, the variable font will be smaller. And it will also, as well as giving you more design richness, it also gives you the saving in file size. Okay, so that was variable fonts. Let's go on to color fonts. This example here, actually, I saw a talk about maybe 4 or 5 years ago at ATypI. There was a guy who'd gone to India and found there was all these sign painting, like hand-painted signs that were being done. And that art was kind of dying out because, well, people just picked something and did it on a vinyl printer or something like that. But people were still around that had been doing this sort of thing, and their father taught them and whatever, and it was dying out. So he wanted to capture this, and he went to people and said, you know, I want you to design fonts for me. We don't have a computer. It's okay. Just draw it out, draw what you want, and I'll do the conversion. And this is the sort of thing that they delivered. It was like a piece of cloth as long as this stage with letters this big painted in beautiful colors. And it's like, oh, but we can't do that. It has to be just a single color. They're like, well, that sucks. So we want color fonts. And, you know, we've had colored manuscripts for a long time. I mean, here's an example of a nice medieval illuminated manuscript. And how often when you're doing work for clients have you needed to, no, okay, you haven't really wanted to do an illuminated manuscript. What you actually wanted was this sort of thing. This is why we really have color fonts. Because we have emoji, and the emoji have to be colored, and they have to have different variations for skin tone and all this sort of stuff. So this was actually the primary driver for us getting color fonts. So you can do this in print, obviously, pretty easily, right? But on the web, the problem is, this looks nice. Does it look nice? Yeah, okay, it sort of looks nice. Until, okay, let's have a look at the source code for this. We've got the same text 9 times. Search engine optimization down the drain. Your accessibility is terrible. The people with screen readers are cursing at you because they get the same text, they get the same text, they get the same text, they get the same text. I'm not going to get rid of this website. So this is the bad and terrible way to do it, before color fonts existed. Okay, but now there are tools that let you bring in those separate fonts, colorize them, save them out as a single color font. So here's an example. This one is using a new table in OpenType called color, C-O-L-R. And that holds the outlines. But as opposed to normal fonts where you've just got a single outline per glyph, you've got multiple ones. And they all have an index into a table of colors called the palette. So there we have it. Now this is real, right? This is actual editable text. I can go in there and change it, and whoo! And I can totally destroy my slide. So anyway, there we are. Now we have a multicolored font. It's a real font. There's only a single copy in the text. Is that cool? Is it? It's terrible. Don't applaud, this is awful. What happened? I went into the font tool, I set the colors individually, and I saved out a font file. If I want to put that font on my website and then change the styling, where did the styling go? I have to make the font again. No, we will not do it like this. So in CSS4, we have, firstly, a new property called font palette, because some fonts have multiple palettes, like here it is for light screens, here it is for dark backgrounds, that sort of thing, so you can choose one. But even better, a new @font palette values. It's an rule which contains overrides or a completely new palette. You can put the styling, you can put the colors in your CSS where it should have been, and then use these fonts. Oh, sure, if you don't use that, you'll get the default, but now it's a default baked-in colors, not something that you can't change. This is cool. This is the correct way to do it. So here's another example. In this case, it's using SVG glyphs. Now, Not to be confused. Has anyone ever used SVG fonts? Yeah, don't do them anymore. You used to do that in the past, right, but not anymore. SVG fonts was a terrible hack. It was like when SVG first happened, we realized, especially on mobile phones, like they didn't have access to fonts, but they wanted to have something nice. Downloadable fonts didn't work, so what we did was we hacked together a quick thing. Instead of taking your nice text and then, in Illustrator or something and saying convert to curves, at which point you've got exactly the right look, but it's not text anymore, you can't search it. Instead, we said, okay, convert to curves, stick them all in these elements, and we'll sort of hack up a quick font format inside SVG itself. Now, that was actually quite terrible. The internationalization was awful, so this is not that. What this is instead is proper OpenType fonts, except instead of using TrueType glyphs, it's using SVG to draw the actual glyphs. Everything else is the same, so it's much nicer. So we have the SVG table for the glyphs. We've got CPAL again for the palettes. Now we have CSS4 to actually style the coloring. And again, this is editable. So the examples I gave you, the color and the SVG, these are actual vector-colored glyphs. There is also other ones, like Apple has one called SBIX, and Google has one which uses PNG images. Don't use those. They're terrible because they're basically pixels. And once you get beyond a certain size, they just stop working. Handy, funny thing to see in Chrome, actually. You increase the font size, and suddenly the top and bottom starts clipping off, and eventually the whole thing disappears. So don't use that. You need to use vectors instead. So here's an example. As you can see, we have the at rule, which says what family it's applying to, which palette it's changing. You can actually change a palette that isn't there. You can make a new palette. That's fairly recent, so I haven't got it in this example. And then we've got a list of colors, starting with color 0 and so on. And then we can just change that to be some other color, and there they go. Changing color in the CSS like it should be. Now it looks horrible, but at least you can see that I can change the color in the style sheet. So this is okay. This is the way it ought to be. Here's a variable font, which is also a color font. It contains a single glyph. And you've heard of like the X height and the cap height and this sort of thing. Well, this one has a cap height axis, which affects the height of the cap. Typographers and their little jokes. Okay, a new thing. Now, this has just got into the spec like in the last 6 weeks or so. Supports. So when you're downloading a font, you can say URL parentheses, bzz, and then you say format WOF or something like this. And then there was a proposal to say we also want format WOF dash variations or WOF dash color or something. And this was obviously a bad syntax, so we changed it. So now we have this thing called supports. So inside the format, we say OpenType first, and then supports color. And which of the types of color, because there's 4 of them. So here, in this example, what we're doing is we're saying, if you support this COLR form of color fonts, download this. Otherwise, download the black and white one. So you have a nice fallback. And this is the full list. You can ask for support for features, support for variations, support for the various color things, and support for palettes. And that lets you do quite a nicely crafted fallback when you're deploying color fonts. Okay, so we're almost done here. We're now going on to the old stuff, the stuff you can definitely use right now. So what have we got here? That's an interesting font. It has some unusual features. But it's just using regular characters. It's only the font that has these. So OpenType features are basically a set of stylistic attributes that you can control. And then in CSS, you say which of those you want. Now, when I first started giving talks about this, which is now, it's 4 or 5 years old now, I used to have to explain that there were 2 syntaxes. There was font variant, which is nice and easy to understand. And then there was font feature settings, which is very low level and uses cryptic little codes and everything. You don't have to make that choice anymore. Font variant, for all the things I'm about to show you, is supported widely. So here's an example. If you look at this, the uppercase characters don't match very well. The lowercase characters are looking nice here. We've got ascenders and descenders on the lowercase letters, and we've got ascenders and descenders on the fonts, on the numbers. This is what's called old-style numbers. But what we want, really, for the capitals is to do it, that's the normal way, where there are no ascenders and descenders. I'm changing it on both lines, but obviously in an actual style sheet, you would change it depending on what your title is or what your numbers are. Let me just fix something. There we go, that's better. So you either say lining numbers or you say old-style numbers, and that's how you change between them. Here's another example. In Unicode, there are code points for things like a half or a quarter, right, for common fractions. The problem with that is, firstly, if you're trying to search for a quarter, you're not going to find it. You're probably not going to put in the character for a quarter. And similarly, if you want like 13/27ths, you're not going to find a character for that. Instead, what you do is you put a slash like this, and then you turn on a single open type feature, and suddenly they all turn into fractions. Now, this is much better. It's a good fallback, because if it's not supported, it's still readable. It's still indexable, searchable. It still works with text-to-speech and so on. But it looks nice. Here's another one. Imagine these are three numbers. Imagine this is money, and you're trying to quickly imagine which is the biggest one. Well, one begins with 1, one begins with 8, another one 2. So the one beginning with 8 is probably the biggest number. But it isn't. It's because these don't line up. Now, you can fix this. You can say, I'm going to use a monospaced font. But a monospaced font looks terrible. What you actually want to have is a proportional font, except the numbers are tabular. Like that. Now they all line up, and you can see what you're doing. So again, nice fallback here. If that property isn't supported, you'll still have the same numbers. They just won't be laid out quite as nicely. All of these are like incremental improvements. Another example, first, second, third, fourth. And if I put on the ordinal property, then they become like that. Nicely scaled down, they look better. If you did that using markup with like soup and whatever, you would get a smaller one. It wouldn't look as good. This switches on the correct form. By the way, that's supposed to work in lots of different languages. This one is in English, firstly, because, well, it makes it more easy, but also when I tried it in French, for example, it didn't work, depending on the browser. So you have to file bugs. If your language that you speak isn't supported with that, file a bug on Chrome. Cough. All right, this is the font that I started off with. And I'm now going to switch on discretionary ligatures. And woo, the RO and the LE suddenly become nicer, interesting ligatures. So these are the optional ligatures. That's what discretionary means. But you can also switch them completely off. Now look at the FL on the second line. OK, instead of using an FL ligature, it's now using a separate F and an L, and they're colliding. They're actually sticking into each other. So you normally don't want to do this. But you can if you need to for a particular purpose. Have you ever downloaded a font to use on your website? You use font face. You're only downloading a single one. This is before variable fonts. And then you merrily go asking for bold and italic, and they show up on the page, right? Even though you don't actually have bold and italic. The browser is faking it for you. It's slanting it over to make an oblique. It's fake bolding. It's drawing a very thin line around the glyph and then merging that together. And it looks terrible. And so there's a way to switch it off. Font synthesis. This is the initial value saying both weight and style. But if I set it to none, ooh, now we get, obviously, if you were doing this yourself, you would actually use some other styling. You'd use color, or you would use something else. But it means if I don't want fake bold, I can actually stop having it. Okay, this one does actually have a bold, but it doesn't have an oblique. This is the most awful example. So this is a nice swirly font, but if I hadn't switched off the synthesis, the browser would try to make an obliqued version of the italic font, which is really hideous. So this property is good. And by the way, we've extended this. In Fonts 4, we also have a way for you to avoid fake small caps, because small caps also tends to look terrible when the browser tries to do it itself. And variable fonts let you do that in a better way anyway. Okay, kerning. Who can tell me what kerning means? Yes? So it's when you have two letters and you want to move them together or further apart so they look evenly spaced visually. If you were to measure them, they're not evenly spaced anymore, but visually they look like that. So good old CSS auto initial value means do whatever you do, and normal means switch kerning on. There's no change here because I'm using these slides in Firefox, and Firefox switches the kerning on by default. Some browsers, especially, for example, Chrome on Android, switches it off by default because it thinks it's faster. It's not clear that it really is faster. But there is also another value of the property which actually does switch this off. So if I say none, then you look at the V and the A, they suddenly go further apart. It looks like there's an uneven gap now. And now kerning should not be confused with letter spacing. Letter spacing is a constant amount of increase. Oops. There we go. So we can put a constant increase, and we can also, of course, put a constant decrease. And in fact, we can make it negative as well if we really want to do stupid things. And in fact, don't ever do this. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, this is all great, Chris, but how do I find out? You've got all these features. How do I know if they work? Apart from just trying them out, and then maybe I got the syntax wrong, or maybe my font doesn't support it. So there's a really amazing website called What Can My Font Do, which stands for What Can My Font Do? Clever little title. And I'm just going to show you that before I finish. There we are. And we're going to grab a font. So let's look at this one for a start. You just drop it on. It's not being uploaded, by the way. It's just this is all being done in the browser. And it says, OK, this is a fairly boring font. It has 232 characters and has 2 layout features. So that's not that. It has standard ligatures and it has kerning. Let's check a more interesting one. OK, this has 25 layout features. Look at this. And there is an example of all of them, ornamentals, stylistic alternates, etc. And for all of these, right at the end, once it's shown you all the things that it can do, there's some CSS which you can just download. And that means you can put a style. You say, I want stylistic alternates. You just say style as stylistic alternates, and then it does it all for you behind the scenes. So it's a very, very nice website. Definitely recommend playing with this. Okay, and I think that's me. Yes. Okay, I'll be around on the lounge if people have any questions. And I see I have 6 minutes remaining, so I'll do a quick dance. No, I won't. That's it. That's me finished. Thank you.
Oh.
Just talk among yourselves.
Yes. I forgot the chocolates, but you'll get them later. So, very nice talk, Chris. It was really awesome. Really awesome that you could make the time for you to be here. Chris Lilley, everybody. Big round. So.